His head hit the pavement with a sound that didn't belong to a living body. It was the kind of sound that made people flinch, even if they were drunk, even if the music from the club pounded so loud it made the ground shake. But that night no one flinched. No one looked back. Lusaka's night didn't stop for one more body falling under the neon lights of Cairo Road. The boy was probably in his early 20s. Jeans soaked with brown liquor, face bruised from a fight he couldn't win, and eyes rolled so far back they showed only white. His name was Kaluba, but no one there knew him. He was just another lost boy in the city's loud, glittering throat. The street was full of life. Music from passing cars, girls in heels too high for the broken pavements, men in stained white shirts barking into their phones. The scent of roasted maize mixed with sweat and exhaust smoke. And in the middle of it all, Kaluba lay motionless, his chest barely rising, like he was deciding whether to live or die. She saw him, from across the road, leaning against a metal railing outside a shut-down salon. She watched the world ignore him. She didn't wear much. Short skirt, black boots, a tight red top that shimmered when headlights passed. Her hair was done well, even though her face carried the heaviness of someone older than her years. People called her Ruth, but no one knew if it was her real name or one she picked off a billboard. Ruth had been watching the nightclub crowd for hours. It was a slow night. Men wanted to look but not spend. And she was tired. Tired in her bones, not just her feet. Tired in the kind of way that no bath could clean and no rest could fix. She could have walked away, could have pretended like she hadn't seen the boy collapse like a puppet whose strings had been cut. But something in her feet turned, slowly, almost involuntarily. She crossed the street without hurry, like she had done it 100 times, like she wasn't even thinking. Kaluba was lying half inside a puddle of dirty rainwater, the flashing red lights from the club casting his body in strange colors. One shoe was gone. His phone was halfway out of his pocket. His wallet glinted like a prize for any thief smart enough to care. Ruth didn't steal it. Instead, she knelt beside him, her knees wet from the broken concrete. Her fingers touched his pulse. Still alive, barely, she looked around, no one watching. No one stopping. Just voices and car horns and the thump-thump-thump of a bass line too loud for sorrow. She took off her own jacket, thin, synthetic leather, and folded it under his head. Then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She prayed. "God," she whispered, hands trembling slightly as she pressed them together. "I know I haven't spoken to you in a while. Maybe you stopped listening. Maybe I stopped talking. But this boy, he's someone's child, and you still know what that means." Her lips moved without sound after that, her eyes closed. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it before it reached her chin. She sat with him, for minutes. Maybe hours. She didn't count. And then, he stirred. It was a soft, pained grunt. Kaluba blinked slowly, confused. The club was behind him. The sky was above him, but a stranger's face was in front of him, calm and quiet, like a moon caught in the city's smoke. "You're alive," Ruth said gently. Kaluba tried to sit up, but failed. His head dropped back onto the jacket. "Who are you?" he mumbled. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out something no one in that street would have expected. A small, black Bible, worn at the edges. Pages soft from use. There was tape on the spine. It smelled faintly of dust and lavender soap. Ruth held it out. "Take it," she said. He blinked, still dazed. "What is this?" "It's yours now," she replied. "My name's inside. In case you forget where it came from." Kaluba stared at her, at the Bible, at her face. Something about her expression didn't match the rest of her. Her clothes, her makeup, the city she belonged to. Her eyes carried a sadness that felt too heavy to fake. A kind of ancient grief. And then, just like that, she stood, without waiting for thanks. Without explaining herself. She crossed the road again and disappeared into the smoke and neon. Kaluba sat up slowly, clutching the Bible to his chest like a lifeline, like an anchor. His hands shook. His mind was a storm. He didn't know who she was, or why she helped him, but something deep inside, something he hadn't felt in years, flickered to life. That night, long after the club closed, long after the music stopped and the city exhaled its last breath before dawn, Kaluba walked home with the Bible still in his hands. Inside the front cover, in faded ink was written, Ruth Mwansa, if lost, return to God. And below it, in smaller handwriting, Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. Kaluba didn't know it yet. But his life had just changed. Not because of a sermon, not because of a preacher, but because a woman the world had thrown away had stopped to kneel. Ruth was already gone by the time the city remembered it had a heart. She walked down Cairo Road like a ghost, slipping between cars and shadows, her heels clicking softly against broken pavement. The Bible was no longer in her bag. It had been with her for years, like a piece of her past she couldn't throw away. And now, it was in the hands of a drunk boy who didn't even know her name. But that was okay, because once, a long time ago, she had been someone else. The streetlights flickered above her as she walked past shops that were shut, their metal gates locked tight. Posters for lost children and gospel concerts clung to the walls, torn at the edges. Somewhere in the distance, a preacher shouted through a megaphone, promising heaven to anyone who came forward. Ruth didn't flinch. She had heard all the promises before. She turned down a narrow alley and stopped at the rusty door of a crumbling 2-story building. The lock was broken, like always. She pushed it open with her shoulder and climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. Her room was on the 2nd floor, small, dim, but quiet. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, and the bed sagged in the middle. She sat on the edge of the mattress, slowly pulling off her boots. Her feet were swollen, but she didn't mind. She reached for a plastic basin, poured in cold water, and dipped her feet. It stung, but it helped. She stared at the wall across from her bed, where an old photograph hung by a piece of tape. It was faded, but clear enough to show who she had once been. Ruth Mwansa, age 19, choir leader. The picture was taken inside a small church in Chibolya, one of Lusaka's older neighborhoods. She stood with a microphone in her hand, wearing a long dress and a wide smile. Behind her, the church band clapped and sang. It had been a youth revival service. That night, the pastor said she had the spirit of Deborah, strong, wise, born to lead. People used to call her Mama Ruth, even though she was barely out of school. She had dreams then. Big ones. She wanted to preach. She wanted to open a shelter for girls like her, fatherless, poor, but burning with faith. She prayed every morning, fasted on Fridays, kept her Bible under her pillow like a sword against the world. And then, the world pushed back. It started with her uncle, the man who was supposed to take care of her after her mother died. He said food wasn't free, and neither was shelter. At first it was just words. Then came the touches. Then came the silence. She told the pastor. He prayed, but nothing changed. She ran away. For weeks she slept at the back of the church behind the drums. The night guard gave her bread and tea, but after a while, even the church grew tired of her tears. You can't stay here forever, they said. So she left. And the streets opened their arms, not with love, but with teeth. She tried to clean houses, sell vegetables, braid hair, but Lusaka is not kind to girls with nothing. It whispers lies to them, promises survival if they just close their eyes. She became Ruth the hustler. Then Ruth the lady. Then just Ruth, the girl with makeup too bright and eyes too empty. But she never stopped believing. Every Sunday, even after working all night, she would stand outside the church gates on Independence Avenue. Too ashamed to go in, but too stubborn to forget. She would listen to the choirs from a distance. She would close her eyes and sing along silently. The faith never died. Even if the dreams did, that's why the Bible stayed in her bag. Not because she was perfect, but because she still hoped. Hope was the only thing the world hadn't taken, Meanwhile, Kaluba couldn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his small room, holding the Bible with both hands like it might vanish if he let go. His head throbbed from the alcohol and his face ached from the fight. But his heart felt something strange. He had been called many things: drunkard, disappointment, waste of talent. His mother had cried for him. His father had stopped speaking to him. The church? That was a place for clean people. People who didn't get kicked out of school. People who didn't steal their cousin's phone to buy weed. But that night, a woman who lived on the edge of the city, who sold her body to survive, had sat beside him and prayed, and then given him her Bible. Why? He turned the pages slowly. The corners were soft. Some verses were underlined. There were notes in the margins, written in careful, slanted handwriting. God sees me. Even here, forgive again. And again. Psalm 51, my rescue rope. He found himself crying without understanding why. The tears came quietly. Not loud, not dramatic. Just slow rivers from somewhere deep inside. He hadn't cried in years. Not since his little brother died in his arms from asthma. Not since the day he realized his parents had given up on him. Now, a stranger's Bible was bringing all the pain back, but also something else. Light. 3 days later, Kaluba stood outside the same nightclub, sober. He had come looking for her. He asked a vendor who roasted maize, "You know a woman named Ruth? Tall, wears red sometimes?" The vendor narrowed his eyes. "You mean the one who works this street corner?" Kaluba nodded. "Yes, but she gave me this." He showed the Bible. The vendor stared at it for a long time. "She hasn't been here. Not since the weekend. Where can I find her?" The man shook his head. "She moves around, but sometimes she goes to the church on Milady Road. Doesn't go inside. Just stands outside." Kaluba felt a strange pull in his chest. He left immediately. When he reached the church, it was quiet. Tuesday afternoon. No services. Just a cleaner mopping the floor. But outside the gate, he saw her. Ruth. She wore a long scarf over her head this time. No makeup, no heels, just plain slippers and tired eyes. She was humming something under her breath. Kaluba approached slowly. She looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled, but something passed between them. Something deeper than thanks, deeper than explanation. A kind of recognition, like two people who had both drowned and survived. The church doors had once opened for Ruth like arms, but now they stared at her like eyes, cold, silent, watching. She stood outside the iron gates of Mount Horeb Mission Church, her hands inside the sleeves of her faded sweater, shoulders hunched from both the wind and the weight of memory. The choir was inside, practicing for Sunday. Their voices floated out through the windows like smoke, sweet, warm, and painful. She used to be inside those walls. Now she stood outside, on the pavement like a forgotten ghost. Kaluba watched her from across the road. He didn't approach yet. He wanted to understand who she truly was. This woman who had saved him without knowing him. The woman who prayed without being seen. The woman who carried both shame and scripture in the same breath. He crossed the road slowly and stood beside her. Ruth glanced at him, but said nothing. Just nodded. Her eyes returned to the church building. "I found you," Kaluba said quietly. She nodded again. A long silence passed between them. It was not awkward. It was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has history in it. Finally, Kaluba asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Why do you stand out here?" "But never go inside?" Ruth smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind that tasted like metal, bitter and tired. "Because that used to be my church," she said. "I was a leader there. Years ago," Kaluba blinked. "You, a leader?" She turned to him slowly. "Does that surprise you?" He looked away, ashamed. "I guess. You didn't think someone like me could preach," she finished for him, her voice soft, not angry. "You're not the first." She stepped closer to the gate and gripped the bars with both hands. Her eyes were full of remembering. I was just 17 when they gave me the youth ministry. Every Friday, I preached to over 50 young people. We fasted together, sang, prayed all night. People said I was anointed, that I had the fire of God. She smiled again, eyes distant. One Sunday, the main pastor asked me to speak during second service. I preached about forgiveness, about how we all fall, but grace lifts us back. The congregation clapped. Some even cried. Afterwards, a woman walked up and said, "You are going to be Lusaka's next great voice." Then her voice changed, became lower. But 2 months later, "I got pregnant," she paused. Kaluba's throat tightened. "He said nothing. I didn't even know how to explain it," Ruth continued. "I had been trying to forget what my uncle did. The nightmares, the fear, but I was pregnant. And when I told the church elders," she shook her head. "They didn't ask how. They didn't ask why. They didn't even ask who. They only asked one question." She turned to look at him again. "Are you still fit to lead?" Kaluba felt his chest ache. I told them the truth, that I had been abused, that I didn't ask for any of it. But it didn't matter. The shame was too loud. They told me to step down. They told me to rest for a season. That season became forever. They replaced me before I even gave birth. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she wiped it quickly. And then, the baby died. Silence. The city seemed to hush for a moment. Even the choir inside the church paused, as if the weight of her words reached through the bricks and windows. "I stopped going," she said. "I couldn't stand the stares, the whispers. So I disappeared." She pointed to the Bible in Kaluba's hands. "That Bible is all I had left from that time. I carried it through shelters, streets, beatings, hunger, even nights I hated myself. It reminded me that even if the church gave up on me, God hadn't." Kaluba swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." She looked at him with eyes that held no bitterness. "You didn't do it." "I used to hate the church too," he admitted. "They said I was a curse, that everything I touched would break. When I lost my scholarship, my pastor told me I wasn't praying hard enough. When my brother died, they said it was judgment." He looked down. "I started drinking the same night they buried him." They stood in silence. Two broken people outside the gates of a place that once promised healing and then failed them. Then Ruth said something that made Kaluba shiver. "I still believe in the word, just not always the people who preach it." The wind blew through the trees beside the building. A dry leaf danced across the church compound like a child who didn't know it wasn't welcome. Kaluba looked at her again. "Why give me your Bible then, if it brought you so much pain?" "Because it also brought me life," she said. "The pain wasn't from the Bible. It was from people who used it wrong. But that book saved me more times than I can count. When I wanted to disappear, I'd read Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," and somehow, I'd wake up the next morning still breathing." She touched his shoulder. "I saw you lying there that night, and something told me, this one still has a future. I didn't need to know your story. I just knew. God hadn't finished with you yet." Kaluba closed his eyes. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve her kindness. But she gave it anyway. "Do you think he hasn't finished with you either?" he asked. Ruth looked up at the church. Then she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "But maybe I'm still breathing too." That evening, as the sun bled gold over the city, casting long shadows on the pavement, Ruth and Kaluba sat side by side on the curb, not as preacher and convert, not as sex worker and drunk, but simply as two souls who had not yet given up. And far behind the stained glass windows and clean pews, a deeper, quieter kind of church was forming, one built from scars instead of titles, one that knew grace doesn't knock, it waits outside. The night Ruth disappeared, the sky wept. It wasn't just rain, it was a slow, quiet kind of rain. The kind that didn't flood the streets but soaked the bones. The kind of rain that made streetlights look like distant stars and turned every sound into a whisper. Kaluba sat on the bench outside Mount Horeb Mission Church, the Bible still in his hands, just like that first night. It had been a week since he last saw her, a full week since she stood outside the gates and spoke truth heavier than most sermons. Since she gave him something no one else ever had. Not money, not pity, but grace. She didn't show up the next day, or the day after, or the one after that. The maize vendor near the club hadn't seen her. The women on the street said she'd vanished, maybe moved on to another part of town, or maybe something worse. Kaluba searched places he didn't want to go, alleys, shelters, hospitals, nothing. No Ruth. But he didn't stop coming to the church, not to go inside. Just to sit where she had stood. To read the Bible she left him, to hear the choir rehearse, and maybe, just maybe, feel a bit of her spirit still hanging in the air. That Thursday, the rain kept falling, and then, just before 7 p.m., as the church bells rang for evening prayer, a woman walked out of the shadows. It was Ruth, but she looked different, no makeup. No boots, no perfume, just a long plain skirt, a white blouse, and her natural hair tied back in a scarf. She walked like someone who had just made peace with a war no one else could see. Kaluba stood up so fast he almost dropped the Bible. "Ruth!" She smiled, tired but whole. "I thought you were gone," he said. "I was," she replied. "But I had to come back, just for tonight." They sat on the same bench, just outside the church gates. "I went back home," Ruth said after a while. Kaluba turned to her. "Home, Chibolya?" "The old house. My mother's. It's broken down now. Roof is falling in. But the old cupboard was still there. And inside it, I found my notebook from youth ministry. Sermon outlines, prayer requests, dreams." She looked away for a moment, her eyes filling. "I used to write letters to God in that notebook. I found one I wrote when I was 17. It said, 'Use me, Lord, even if I'm not perfect.'" She turned to Kaluba. "Do you think he's still using me?" He nodded without hesitation. "He used you to save me." A long silence followed. The church choir inside began a slow worship song. Soft voices, harmonies like the hum of angels. And then Ruth did something Kaluba didn't expect. She stood and walked to the gate. It was open, wide open. She stood there for a long time, staring into the courtyard, the building, the stained glass glowing with golden candlelight. Her hands trembled. "I haven't walked through these doors in over 10 years, she whispered. Kaluba stood beside her. "You don't have to. Just being here is enough." But Ruth shook her head. "No, I think I need to go in. Not to be seen, not to be accepted, but to leave the pain here, to give it back to God. I've carried it too long." And slowly, like a woman climbing out of her own grave, Ruth stepped inside. Kaluba followed, silent. The prayer meeting had already started. A few people sat scattered on wooden pews, eyes closed, heads bowed. A woman stood near the front, leading worship with a microphone. No one noticed Ruth at first. She slid quietly into a back row. Her hands folded. Her eyes closed. Her lips moved in a prayer only she and God could hear. Kaluba watched her. There was no flash of light. No voice from heaven. But there was peace. A deep, aching kind of peace. The kind that feels like the first breath after being underwater too long. After a few minutes, Ruth opened her eyes. She reached into her small handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The sermon note from her old notebook. She handed it to Kaluba. "You keep this," she said. "It's the last one I ever wrote." He opened it. At the top, written in faded ink, was the title, "Grace Doesn't Ask for Permission." Beneath it, a single line of scripture. "While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Romans 5:8, and under that, in her teenage handwriting, "Some of us are bleeding in places no one sees. But God still sees and still calls." Kaluba held the paper like treasure. Ruth stood again. "I have to go now," she said. "Go where?" he asked. She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes looked free. "I'm going to Kitwe. There's a women's center there. A friend I used to sing with runs it now. They help girls start over." You'll leave Lusaka? She nodded. I have to. This city knows me too well. I need a place that only knows my future, not my past. She smiled gently. But promise me something. Anything, Kaluba said. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Keep reading. Keep walking, and when the time comes, give that Bible to someone else who's falling. He nodded, blinking fast to hold back the tears. Ruth turned and walked out of the church into the rain. This time, he didn't stop her. He just watched. 1 year later, Mount Horeb Church held a youth revival service, the biggest in years. The speaker was a clean-shaven young man with a quiet voice and a deep story. His name was Kaluba M. Zulu. He stood on stage, holding a small, worn-out Bible in one hand and a faded sermon note in the other. This message, he told the crowd, was not taught to me in a classroom. It was given to me by a woman the world ignored. A woman who taught me that God doesn't just use the perfect. He uses the willing, even the broken. He paused, voice trembling. I don't know where she is now, but I pray she knows. She didn't just give me a Bible. He looked up at the crowd, full of youth who were hungry for something real. She gave me my life back.